Hi, I'm Peter J. Ray. Welcome to Adventures in History. Today's topic is Andrew Johnson, Part 3, Tennessee Governor. We stopped last time in 1853. Andrew Johnson had been elected governor of Tennessee, and he arrived in Nashville, the state capital, just in time to be sworn in as Tennessee governor on October 17th. And he gave a speech. He called on Democrats to return to, quote, primitive Republican simplicity and economy within the ancient landmarks laid down by Thomas Jefferson and his patriotic associates. And then he continued, democracy is a ladder corresponding in politics to the one spiritual which Jacob saw in his vision, one up which all, in proportion to their merit, may ascend. That's a nice reference, biblical reference to the Bible, Jacob's ladder. David Campbell, the former Virginia governor, had this to say about Andrew Johnson's Jacob's ladder speech. Quote, he has more the appearance of a French demagogue than an American citizen. So now Nashville was in the Cumberland Valley, still is. The population then was 32,000 people. Now, Andrew Johnson's power was limited by the Tennessee Constitution, in which the governors really did not have much power. His enemy, David Campbell, called Johnson a French demagogue and said the only difference is that a Frenchman who pretended to say anything at all would express himself much better as to style. Yeah, so the limited power of the Tennessee governor consisted of the big thing was giving a biannual message to the legislature in which he would suggest legislation. Basically, it was the power of public opinion. The governor could say things that he believed in, and if he was popular, then the legislature might feel public pressure to follow through and support those measures. Andrew Johnson seldom had strong support among Democratic Party leaders. His popularity, his power came from his popularity with the common people who voted for him in elections. Yeah, the governors would give these biennial message to the people of the state of Tennessee, indicating what they were interested in. And for Andrew Johnson, as Tennessee governor, this gave him exposure and a springboard to higher honors. James K. Polk had been Tennessee governor and became U.S. president. Now, one of the things Andrew Johnson talked about, he was against using convicts, men who were in prison convicts, in the trades, competing against honest workers. This would depress wages, so he was against prison workers working. And it was sort of which in a sense encouraged arresting people for vagrancy and having them in prison for working for nothing. Now, Andrew Johnson's family, his wife, and children stayed in Greenville. They did not come with him to Nashville. 1854, Andrew Johnson turned down invitations from wealthy people to take his first meal with them at a New Year's party, and instead he was at a New Year's Eve party with rivermen at the house of a riverman roustabout. In February, the Tennessee legislature passed Andrew Johnson's bill, regarding taxes, that doubled spending for public schools. He was a big believer in education. They established an agricultural bureau to help farmers, something he supported. As Tennessee governor, Andrew Johnson had the power to pardon criminals, and he was very lenient, and he did pardon many felons. So he had a tendency for mercy. He was considered, people saw him as a hard man, but he definitely could be hard, but he also had this soft side. Andrew Johnson. Also in 1854, Andrew Johnson received a handmade shovel from Judge William W. Pepper, who was proud of his origins as a blacksmith. Andrew Johnson responded by sewing a broadcloth coat, which he sent to Judge Pepper. Now the idea at that time was that workers were were not respected. Now, Andrew Johnson was proud of himself, and he was believed that farmers and trade workers were the foundation of the country. March of 1854, there was a break, and Andrew returned to his family in Greenville, whom he missed. 1855, Andrew Johnson ran for re-election for Tennessee governor. His opponent was Meredith B. Gentry, a Whig, who got support from the Know Nothing Party, and the temperance movement was powerful. Those who were trying to ban alcohol. Now, Andrew Johnson opposed a law making alcohol illegal, so he did not support their wishes. And Andrew Johnson did win the election. He was against the Know Nothing Party, which was anti-foreign and anti-immigrant and anti-Catholic. Andrew Johnson always liked to say that immigrants helped win the War of Independence and contributed to American greatness, and that being anti-Catholic violated American religious freedom. 1855, Andrew Johnson said, quote, "The devil, his satanic majesty, presided over a secret conclave held in Pandemonium to make war on all Christian churches. By making war against one of them, the Know-Nothings had become allies of the Prince of Darkness." Well, that's a really good reference there. The devil in Pandemonium. Now, during the campaign, there were debates across Tennessee in the towns of Murfreesboro, Pulaski, Shelbyville, Petersburg, Clarksville, Nashville, Franklin, and Knoxville. Andrew Johnson, during the campaign, said this about a person who was in the Know Nothing Party, quote, he called him, quote, "a huge reptile, upon whose neck the foot of every honest man ought to be placed." So Andrew was reelected. His enemy, William Brownlow, said, quote, "I pronounce your governor here upon his own dunghill an unmitigated liar and calumniator and villainous coward." Wow, what a descriptive sentence. Andrew Johnson had his second term. Again, there was little power, but an opportunity to be known, to keep his name out there in politics. And since Andrew was popular with the people, the legislature was passing things that he was promoting. He proposed a universal system of weights and measures for Tennessee, which was passed. He also authorized the purchase of the Hermitage, Andrew Johnson's home, with the proposal that it be used as a U.S. government branch for West Point. This pleased Andrew Johnson. He was very busy in December of 1855 and unable to come home for Christmas. He also missed his daughter's December 13th wedding in Greenville. He couldn't get away. He was, a hard worker, dedicated. So he missed his daughter's wedding and Christmas in 1855. Of course, it's a long way from Nashville to Greenville, Tennessee, and travel at that time was very tough, very slow. Also in 1855, Tennessee had a law which required the removal of free blacks to Africa. So if you were in Tennessee and you were you'd been freed, you had to leave the state, and the state would help you move to Liberia in West Africa. And the governor was responsible for this. Now, at this time, there was a newly freed slave named Hector, and his wife and children were sent to Liberia. Andrew made the arrangements. He sent his son Robert, escorted Hector and his family and 2 other black Americans to Baltimore to sail to Liberia, West Africa. On April 13th, there was a fire in the Nashville Inn. Andrew was getting ready to go home on break. He had $1,200 in cash under his pillow. Now, in this chaos of the fire, he went to help a lady get out, and that $1,200 was lost. Went down up in flames in the fire. So Andrew finally got to go home. He was eager to see his grandchild. Now, sadly, his son Charles had succumbed to alcoholism, so that was very tragic. His son Robert was ill and had a number of heart attacks. And his very young son, Andrew Jr., he enjoyed buying toys for him. It was a short visit. By May 24th, he was back at work in the governor's office in Nashville. 1856 was a presidential election year, and Andrew had a vague hope for the presidency that year. He was ambitious. The Nashville Union and an American newspaper promoted Andrew Johnson to be president that year. However, the Democrats nominated James Buchanan, who was elected. Andrew was disappointed, but he campaigned for Buchanan because they were both Democrats, and Buchanan won. There were clouds on the horizon. The slavery conflict was growing worse and worse. Andrew was uncertain about his future. He was interested in running for the U.S. Senate from Tennessee. In 1856, he decided not to run for re-election for Tennessee governor. He was concerned about his son Robert's health, his son Charles' drinking. Martha, his daughter, gave birth to a son, Andrew Johnson Patterson. In December of 1856, Andrew received a gift horse in recognition of his efforts fighting the Know Nothing Party. He was very happy with this gift horse. Biographer Hans L. Trefus wrote, quote, "It was an agreeable interlude in an otherwise worrisome period." 1857, the U.S. Congress declared they were not interested in obtaining the Hermitage to be a military academy. Early in 1857, Andrew traveled to Washington, D.C. Now, on the trip home, actually on the trip, the train went off the tracks between Augusta and Atlanta, Georgia. The railroad cars fell down an embankment 60 feet, and Andrew Johnson's arm was crushed near the elbow. He went to Atlanta for treatment. It was very slow healing, and he had trouble with that arm for years, really for the rest of his life. So that was very unfortunate. Yeah, sometimes these trains people would get hurt in train accidents. 1857, Andrew was campaigning for the Democratic candidates for the Tennessee governor and legislature. Supporting his party, he gave a speech in Bolivar, Tennessee. He was ill. In the election, the Democrats won in Tennessee. On October 6th, he gave the governor's biennial message. The Democrats had a majority in legislature, and as a result, Andrew Johnson ended up being elected to the U.S. Senate. So that was a big deal. His career, so that was what he had in mind. Hans L. Trefus wrote, quote, "The penniless runaway of 1826 was now a member of the nation's upper house. His triumph could be compared with that of Andrew Jackson." So, as U.S. Senator, Andrew Johnson continued to promote economy, the Homestead Bill. This was difficult because the slave states were against the Homestead Bill because of the influence of large landowners. He didn't like the idea of poor men getting land. In December, Andrew started his career in the U.S. Senate, 1857. The U.S. Senate at that time had 4 fireplace fires and 2 Franklin stoves for heat. Washington, D.C. only had a population of 50,000 people at the time. There was the Neo-Gothic Castle, the Smithsonian Institute, which is still there. The Capitol had 2 wings. The Capitol Dome was not yet finished. In Congress, there were a number of famous congressmen, including Charles Sumner of Massachusetts, William Seward of New York, Jefferson Davis of Mississippi, and Thaddeus Stevens of Pennsylvania, who had a club foot, wore a wig, and was very sarcastic. In Washington, Andrew Johnson lived at the St. Charles Hotel on Pennsylvania Avenue and 3rd Street. He was a very hard worker and a student. Good student. He was always learning. Hans L. Trefus wrote, quote, "Now nearly 50 years old, with dark, piercing eyes, erect carriage, and faultlessly tailored clothes, Andrew Johnson cut an impressive figure. And while his opponents tended to stress his lack of literary interests in his years in Washington, he even tried his hand at poetry." December 22nd, in the U.S. Senate, Andrew Johnson introduced the Homestead Bill Act, 160 acres of free land for poor men. Again, this was unpopular in the South, but he continued to work for that bill. May 20th, 1858, Andrew gave a speech regarding the Homestead Bill. In preparation, he read Barthold Niebuhr's lectures on the history of Rome. He quoted Moses, Vattel, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, and Andrew Jackson. And he said that the agricultural middle class was the key to national success, and that ancient Rome fell because of the decline of the middle class. However, the Senate did not support the bill, did not pass, but he continued to be patient. And Andrew Johnson's Democratic enemies in Nashville continued to plot against him, the Tennessee elite, who were against the supporter of the common man in Tennessee. One of his enemies in Tennessee was John Bell, a leading Whig, and Bell accused Andrew Johnson of carrying, quote, the torch of domestic discord in Tennessee, from Johnson County in the east to Shelby County in the west. Of course, he was a fighter. It seemed like he was always fighting people, so maybe there was some truth to that. Andrew Johnson opposed sending more U.S. Army troops for the Mormon conflict in Utah. The issue there was polygamy. The Mormons tolerated men having more than one wife. And now Johnson said that others practiced polygamy, that in Islam, that Muslim men could have more than one wife, and he said that there should be a practice of religious tolerance. He was willing to accept polygamy in the Mormons, which of course they eventually did give up. Hans L. Trefus wrote, quote, did not Congress spend money to receive representatives of the Sultan of Turkey? Of course, Turkey was a Muslim country which did allow polygamy. 1858, Andrew Johnson voted against a Rivers and Harbors bill. He voted against funds to entertain the visiting Turkish admiral. He supported Washington, D.C. becoming a part of the state of Maryland. The end of congressional session was in June. Andrew did not go home directly. He went to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania to see Dr. Samuel Gross regarding his arm, which continued to give him trouble from that train accident. Now he was able to go home to Greenville the whole way by train, so the train railroads were becoming more and more prevalent. This was in May of that year. Eastern Tennessee. He went to the Eastern Tennessee and Virginia Railroad, which reached Greenville. Hans L. Trefus wrote, quote, in spite of his early opposition to railroads, he must have enjoyed the comfort they were bringing to formerly isolated East Tennessee. December of 1858, Andrew Johnson returned to Washington, D.C. He hoped to continue promoting the Homestead Bill. He had a new friend, Senator Hannibal Hamlin of Maine. He considered Washington, D.C. to be dull. Both parties were waiting for the momentous 1860 election. In February of 1859, there was a debate in the Senate regarding purchasing Cuba. And Democrat from Spain, Democrat Robert Toombs of Georgia, said that the Republicans were shivering in their boots at the mention of Cuba because it was believed this would become another slave state. Regarding the Homestead Bill, land for the landless or Lacklanders, Andrew Johnson wanted to abolish the congressional franking privilege. That means free postage. Andrew Johnson believed that Southern Democrats were too aristocratic. March of 1859, he returned to Greenville. His son Charles was still drinking, and his son Robert intended to run for the Tennessee legislature. 1859, his daughter Martha was pregnant. Charles temporarily stopped drinking. He enjoyed his recess home, and he had Andrew Johnson Prince became available to the public, promoting him to become president in 1860. He continued to buy and sell real estate and make money in that, very successful. He had a considerable fortune. He supported his son, Robert, running for the Tennessee legislature. And Andrew Johnson was a candidate for president in 1860. In 1859, Andrew returned to Washington, D.C., which was in an uproar because of John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry, Virginia, in which he hoped to ignite a slave rebellion, and which failed. He gave a speech Andrew gave a speech regarding the Harper's Ferry and John Brown incident. He blamed the abolitionists for the conflict and said that John Brown was an evil man. Andrew Johnson supported the Union and slavery. He promoted the Homestead Bill, that was ongoing. James S. Green of Missouri said that the Homestead Bill discouraged industry, just giving people land. So that was the opposition. Hans L. Trefus wrote, quote, Hans L. Trefus quoted Andrew Johnson. Andrew said that if the Ten Commandments were to come up for consideration, somebody would find a Negro in them somewhere, and the slavery question could be raised. Southern senators continued to oppose the Homestead Bill. Andrew Johnson voted against the bill regarding the erection of a George Washington statue and money to observe the eclipse of the sun. However, he did support improvements on the Tennessee River. 1859, Andrew had been interested in the presidency since 1852. Hans L. Trefus wrote, quote, his ambition left him no peace. Andrew was seeking the Tennessee Democratic Party endorsement for president, which was in January of 1860, getting ready for the National Democratic Convention. His son Robert was helping, and he was trying to get that endorsement. The Tennessee elite were not happy about that. There was a medium who said that John Brown was in hell and said that Andrew Johnson would win the Democratic nomination for president. Charleston, South Carolina was the site of the convention for the National Democrats in 1860. At the Democratic Convention in Charleston, South Carolina, there was no consensus. They couldn't come up with a candidate, so they announced that they would reconvene in Baltimore, Maryland in June. Andrew's son was proud of his son, Robert. However, Charles was drinking again. Charles was the co-owner of Andrew was the co-owner of a drugstore in Greenville. The Democrats became divided between two candidates in 1860 and wound up having two, Stephen Douglas and John C. Breckinridge. Andrew was depressed, seeing his Democratic Party split. In the election, he supported Breckinridge, but in the election, Abraham Lincoln, the Republican candidate, was elected. John C. Fremont said, quote, Andrew Johnson would have to make the most difficult decision of his life. So the country was headed towards civil war. 1860 election was a disaster for Southern Unionists, a crisis for Andrew Johnson. Eastern Tennessee, there were strong Unionists. And of course, the South was the secession movement was growing. In November, there was a convention in Greenville of Unionists, those folks in Eastern Tennessee, or folks in Tennessee who were loyal to the Union, who did not want to leave. Andrew Johnson wanted a resolution declaring secession unconstitutional. The support for secession in the South was growing. In December, Andrew Johnson was appalled. He opposed secession. And when South Carolina seceded, he called this treason. He did not support it. So the country was getting closer and closer to civil war. On December 18th, Andrew Johnson gave a speech in the U.S. Senate, and he said, quote, I have an abiding faith. I have an unshaken confidence in man's capability to govern himself. I will not give up this experiment that is now called an experiment. I will not give up this government that is now called an experiment. No, I intend to stand by it, and I entreat every man throughout the nation who is a patriot to come forward and rally around the altar of our common country, and lay the Constitution upon it as our last libation, and swear by our God and all that is sacred and holy, that the Constitution shall be saved and the Union preserved. Yes, in the language of the departed Andrew Jackson, let us exclaim that the Union, the federal Union, it must be preserved. This speech became a sensation. This was the beginning of really Andrew Johnson's finest hour, when, as a Southerner, he remained loyal to the Union, when all over the South, people were deciding to support Southern states leaving the United States. Now, in that December 18th speech in Congress, he also said, quote, "If the doctrine of secession is to be carried out upon the mere whim of a state, this government is not stronger than a rope of sand. Its own weight will tumble it to pieces." Now, after this speech, his life was in immediate danger. And now, of course, because Washington, D.C. is in the South. It's between Virginia and Maryland, which are southern states, so especially Virginia. He returned to his on his return to his hotel room in Washington, D.C., people cursed him, and they were yelling at him in the streets. Southerners were outraged at the speech that he gave supporting the Union and opposing secession. The Chicago Tribune wrote this about Andrew Johnson's speech, that he had, quote, the quote, honor of striking the really stunning blow at the treason of the seceding states. Andrew Johnson, during this time, was lionized in the North. He received praise. People thought, wow, this is wonderful, this guy from Tennessee supporting the Union. And his words were circulated by the thousands. He received a letter from a Southerner in Baltimore, and a lover of his country, who said, quote, "Keep on in your noble endeavors, and all will yet be well." So during this time, Andrew was really trying to fight public opinion or influence public opinion in Tennessee and in the South to not secede, to stay loyal to the Union. This speech caused a sensation. There was frequent applause in the galleries. Republicans were happy about it. Southerners were outraged. The Chicago Tribune, again, regarding his speech, called it, quote, "the heaviest blow yet struck by a Southern member against secession." On February 9th, in 1861, in Tennessee, there was a vote against secession, and Andrew Johnson his speech was a factor in Tennessee, at least for the time being, remaining loyal to the Union. Andrew Johnson was condemned in the South as a traitor. However, there was no turning back. This really showed this was the moment. He was a fighter, and this was a time to fight to save the country. For him, there was no turning back. Tennessee was divided between Confederate supporters and Union supporters. His enemy, Parson Brownlow, at this time did support him. Andrew Johnson was hanged in effigy in Memphis, Tennessee. His friends in Greenville supported him. Actually, Eastern Tennessee remained loyal to the Union. His son Robert, who was in Nashville, spoke opposing secession in the Tennessee legislature, and there was frequent references to Andrew Jackson. The Chicago Tribune had this to say about Andrew Johnson's speech, that it was called, quote, "the greatest excitement and indignation among extreme Southern men who denounce him as a traitor and even propose to hang him when they get a chance." In Friars Point, Mississippi, Andrew Johnson was hung in effigy, and the figure was stuffed in a barrel with a sign that said, "Andrew Johnson, the traitor to the South," which was barreled up and rolled into the river at Friars Point. Andrew Johnson was headed toward great popularity in the North and political clout because of his public stance opposing secession. Andrew Johnson reminded Jefferson Davis, the future Confederate States of America president, that if the South stayed in the Union, the Democrats controlled Congress. They could protect the South and the interests of the South. Andrew Johnson believed that the Confederacy in the South was controlled by aristocrats in the South who wanted a monarchy and total power and were against the free men of the South. The justification for secession in the South came from people. One of the things people said was that Abraham Lincoln had said that the government could not endure half slave and half free, and they considered that hostility to slavery. Also, the Underground Railroad helping slaves escape north that was done by Northerners. So really, it was the slavery issue that was really the real problem. Well, that concludes today's presentation. Thanks so much for watching. We'll continue next time with part 4 of the fascinating life of Andrew Johnson. Again, thanks so much for watching. I really appreciate it. God bless you. Take care, and I'll see you next time.